Welcome to Bonded Voices, Season 2, Generation X Edition. Today's episode, we'll be talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall. The fall of the Berlin Wall was one of the most iconic moments in the 20th century. But how did it affect the people that lived with it? As a Generation X person, we thought about unity, change, and hope. This is Loren.
I'm Greg.
And I'm Ian.
So you were starting to talk about, you want to talk about the entire Berlin Wall, not just the fall of it.
I was talking in our intro, I don't just want to cover the fall of the Berlin Wall, as iconic a moment in time as that was. See, for me, born in the 60s, for the next 20-something years, nearly 30 years, the Berlin Wall actually meant something huge and demonic throughout Europe. It split Europe in half. Like the Iron Curtain that Stalin formed after the end of the Second World War had massive consequences. And yes, the fall of the Berlin Wall started the domino effect of knocking it down across Europe. But the Berlin Wall was massive for me. Greg, what was your memory of it?
So, first I'd like to talk a little bit about the history that led up to, much like you wanted to talk about, Ian. What I don't think I realized at the time was the amount of Soviet control, the amount of just absolute control, for lack of a better term, that the communist regime had in place, to the point of where people were trying to flee.
I'm willing to die.
And it was tens of thousands of people.
Yep.
Making the effort to leave. And then the idea behind the Russian government of, now we're putting up this wall. Because this had been going on since World War II, right? They separated Berlin. They did all of this. And then there's food rations. There's the Berlin airdrop that led to supporting the West versus the East, how they were able to survive. All of this oppression, from a political point of view, a capitalist society versus a non-capitalist society, which is not too different from what's going on in politics in America right now. Those that want to push for complete government control. So the idea of the wall being built, what I remember is not really paying a whole lot of attention until pretty close to my senior year in high school, which was when the Berlin Wall came down. But it was also this interesting time where I was listening to more music that was produced outside of the United States. There seemed to be this awakening for me right around the time that the Berlin Wall came down.
The Berlin Wall, for me, we weren't as impacted by it because we're so much further removed from it.
Yeah, you'd already left and gone back to America at that point in time.
Well,
Post-Civil War.
Literally, we weren't, it wasn't shown up in day-to-day life. Whereas if you happened to be in Germany, you could go to Germany and see there's a division between East and West Germany. Whereas for the Americans living here, it was like, oh, it's that, over there, it's not our problem type of thing. What became apparent, and Greg, you and I were talking about a little bit earlier, is that in entertainment, the evil people were always Russian. Whether it was, like you said, Rocky 3, or was it Rocky 3?
Rocky 2, I believe, was Ivan Drago.
What? Okay.
Or was that Rocky 1? Apollo Creed was Rocky 1.
But even same with James Bond movies.
Right.
The enemy
Russian,
was always like a Russian spy or something.
Red Dawn.
Yeah, Red Dawn. Well, even, what is it? Oh, I can't think of the cartoon, the moose.
Bullwinkle.
Bullwinkle, yes.
Yeah. Rocky and Bullwinkle.
Natasha and Boris.
Yeah,
yes.
Right. So think of this, though. If you guys did geography in school, if you look at a map, I always thought Berlin must have been right on the edge of East Germany. It isn't even close.
It's 100 miles.
There's a road that goes into it that was basically walled off on each side, part of East Germany, that gave us access to part of West Germany, which was West Berlin,
right,
as when it was annexed during the war. And it's nowhere near the rest of West Germany. But it's crazy. And growing up, I used to hear about bands like The Cure and Japan, Sex Pistols, the Beatles would go and play in Berlin. I always thought, like, oh, you're on the safe side of the city.
Yeah, you think that the Iron Curtain went through Berlin, and it was half of Berlin's in West Germany and half was in East Germany, and it was on the border.
On the border, but it isn't even close. No, and that was what the amazing part was. So, growing up in England, we obviously the Second World War was very present in our world all the way through the 80s. Because I think it was something that was in movies, it was in music, especially in politics, and the generation who fought in that and the First World War was still alive. So some of them had fought the Germans twice. Others were still alive, and you can only imagine the trauma of you went to a war with your 3 buddies, 2 you came back.
Right.
You had to get on. My grandfather talked about that, about the people who didn't come back. And I think there are obviously people who were in the front lines of combat who probably had it much worse than that.
So here's a question, and I don't know Britain's involvement in Vietnam. I wonder if our involvement in Vietnam shadowed all the Cold War. And so we were not present in, Germans were bad during World War II. We still believe that, but when we were growing up, it was all...
And Vietnam was part of the Cold War.
It was.
Right.
It was. The reason we were...
It wasn't us fighting the Vietnamese, as in America fighting the Vietnamese. It was America and the South Vietnamese fighting the Viet Cong,
right.
Like the North, who were supported by China and Russia. But I think when you look at the reason it had probably more of an impact in England, because there was a bigger percentage of men and women affected by the Second World War in England and Great Britain than there was in America. There's a much smaller percentage affected by it over here. Because you think about it, we had millions go, you had hundreds of thousands. We lost hundreds of thousands, I think. I'm not sure the amount America lost in the Second World War, but I don't think it was hundreds of thousands. It was a much smaller number, because we were in it earlier as well, right? So the Berlin Wall had this, the war isn't over. We sort of won and lost at the same time, because you could sort of freely travel around a lot of Europe prior to the Second World War, and all of a sudden Romania, Hungary, a lot of the Yugoslavia, Poland, they were all cut off. And the Poles were actually very good allies of the Brits, as was seen in the Second World War. When the Dunkirk evacuation happened, a lot of them were Polish, French, and British soldiers who were taken back to Britain.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it was the Polish army. So they fought very valiantly with us in that. But yeah, it had ramifications on everything, and as I say, it seeped into pop culture. One of my favourite records of the 70s, Never Mind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols, Holidays in the Sun, and if you read the verse, the chorus, now I've got a reason, and I'm still waiting, the Berlin Wall. It was mentioned in their song. Japan had a song with it in. It was just a myriad of artists would sing and reference the Berlin Wall, because it was that overshadowing evil that, look, you try to leave, we're going to shoot you. And they did shoot them.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting. I talked to a lady, she was roughly our age, and she was in communist Yugoslavia, and how they had to hide their belongings embedded in their car, and they went on a vacation into another communist country and fled and just left everything behind.
Right.
It's interesting to listen to her. She was 4 or 5 when they fled the country, and then they were refugees in, I think, Norway or Sweden for a while, and just to get away from that oppressiveness. And we take, living in America, everything, our freedom for granted.
You know what's funny is I speak to my next door neighbor. He's from Macedonia, and it was under Tito's rule during the time when the Berlin Wall was up and the Iron Curtain was up. He said his father was beaten by the secret police, and one of his uncles just disappeared. Just gone. And they just took him off, shot him somewhere, and just put him in a ditch.
Didn't like what he had to say.
Yeah, and that's what people don't realize about it. And when he hears people talking about socialism or communism, he gets irate because he's like, they do not know what they're talking about. Their idea that it's everyone's share. He goes, that I lived through the real thing.
Well, the flavor that's being offered at this point in time claims to be some new and improved version.
It always does, though.
That's when we look at history, which is important that we're talking about this because history will repeat itself if we don't study it.
Yeah. And so, when you look at the Berlin Wall and you've got this massively oppressive monolith that runs across Europe, you've got people who are sold into the idea of they try and leave you shoot them. If you don't shoot them, we shoot you. And there's a whole lineage of just keep shooting people until you obey. You have no freedom. You have a very limited life that will always be limited. They had bread lines 200 yards away from Plenty of Bread in Berlin, which was insane. And they wouldn't let them get it.
Right.
They wouldn't allow... They wanted them to live in the misery.
Mm-hmm.
There was no real plan of it. So, the question for you guys, right? We were very much on top of Khrushchev, and then obviously Gorbachev, who came along to follow Khrushchev. Was that Russian politics followed as closely here?
I think Gorbachev, when he came in power, there was because he represented a different ideology.
He was a little softer. Yeah.
I think that I can recall more getting close to the end of my high school time and probably political science class, needing to pay more attention to global politics. I remember Gorbachev much more. I remember Reagan playing a role in that process. But Khrushchev, no.
Because if you remember the story of Gorbachev's rise up through the ranks in the Communist Party to get to be the leader, he's no saint.
Right.
Well, I don't think anyone on that side to be in politics, you can be a saint.
Right. Going all the way back to Trotsky, Lenin, right? It was cutthroat from the get-go. It's almost like a side of things where the moment you get enough bad people, it's like cartels. They're always just waiting for someone else to stab you in the back or shoot you.
Sure.
And so, yes, but at the end of the day, thank God he was influenced enough to not fire on the people who actually started making their way into West Germany in Berlin, because that was actually, there was, the funniest part is that it was a rumor that started that all of a sudden they're going to let people into West Germany.
Right.
And then certain guards were like, well, we're just going to shoot you because we'll get shot if we don't shoot you. And there were people petitioning the embassy. There were people petitioning in the Kremlin saying, you got to stop this or else it's going to get out of hand real quickly.
Well, Tiananmen Square wasn't too far.
It wasn't
prior to that.
Right.
And that was not a good experience.
Was Tiananmen Square before the...
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's hard to remember that. I remember Reagan saying, tear down this wall. And that's his big, what was it, Mr. Gorbachev?
Tear down this wall. But which was amazing because when he was flying over to give that speech in Berlin, he wanted to put that in, and his speechwriters took it out 3 different times. And he said, no, I'm going to say it. And they were like, don't say it. And he's like, nope, I'm going to say it. It was divine. Because if he wouldn't have said those powerful words, maybe nothing would have happened.
Mm-hmm. So some of the research that I was doing on this, there was actually chaos amongst the security detail that day.
Yeah, a lot of
on
chaos.
What was the information that was conveyed.
Yeah.
And then the decision of, okay, we have a handful of armed guards, but we have tens of thousands of people.
Who are
we can only take out a few of them.
Right.
Oh, well, I guess we're opening this up.
And even then, there were what I'd heard is amongst the guards, there were ones that were said, no, it's open. We can go too, but we'll never come back. And you're never going to come back. And they're like, fine.
See ya.
Leave this for that,
Right.
And so even within the guards, there was people saying, no, you've got it wrong. You've got to start shooting them. And others say, no, just go with them.
Mm-hmm.
Take your chance while you got it. Because they thought that was the last it was going to be. But if you look at the politics of the time, it wasn't just, and there's a great book out there called, I think it's The Pope, the Prime Minister and the President. It was about Pope John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and the alliance they had and the influence they had on Russia, because Lech Walesa, who was the opposition leader in Poland, the workers' leader in Poland, was trying to lead a revolution there. The Russians were coming down hard on him. They kept arresting him. But the Pope was from Russia. Pope John Paul was Polish. So they had an issue with, you come down too hard on it, does the Catholic portion of Poland also join the workers, and now you've got a much bigger problem to deal with. Margaret Thatcher and Reagan were putting so much pressure on the Russians with all the nuclear arms race, and then they were helping the Pope as well in guiding the message to the Catholics who were still within the Eastern Bloc that, look, you've got to start looking for freedom, which is the essence of Christianity anyway, is freedom.
Right.
So it's an amazing book and an amazing story. And I think if anyone's a Gen Xer and doesn't have very strong feelings, emotions, memories of the Berlin Wall, I think you were fast asleep.
Well, in defense of us on this side of the pond, depending upon how old you were when you went through, for me, there was the awakening in high school. There was different music. There were different groups of friends that I was hanging out with. And there was also the requirement of political science classes. There was an awakening that happened to me probably junior year, senior year, where I paid more attention to this. After the wall came down, there seemed to be more and more momentum building and just a sigh of relief of, I had no idea this had so much impact.
The ramifications.
Yeah, over here, it wasn't the wall, just the Iron Curtain. It was a concept, but it wasn't physical for us.
Right, it's too far away.
And it wasn't really, for us, it was always the country of the Soviet Union. It wasn't, there's a wall separating. It was, again, all the villains were Soviets or Russians, and then we'd come back to, it's over there. I think one of the main things that made this one so much more impactful was that it was on TV. We got to watch it live, a historical event that changed the world. It's, there's a few historical events that were televised during the 80s, and that's one of them. Tiananmen Square, the Challenger explosion, those were major things that were caught live on TV.
See, I remember being in Australia when it happened, and I remember people who were like, they're just going over there. They didn't even get the concept of prison and freedom.
Right. Oppression.
It was 20 yards apart. And for them, I could remember those people who did Australia even further away, right? So they didn't even get that side of things. But I actually remember tearing up with the idea of people are finally free.
I don't think it. I mean, we'd see it in music. I think there's a couple big songs that came out that were, was it Billy Joel? We Didn't Start the Fire. That kind of
99 Love Balloons.
Well,
99
that one was fascinating because there was a band member that watched. What's the history of that? There was a band member that watched balloons. There was some kid that had balloons, and they escaped the kid and up and over the wall.
Yeah.
And so there's the topic in that song is whether or not that's going to start a war. That what are the soldiers that are under strict control? Is this a sign of, is this an airdrop? Is this what's going on? Which I can remember the novelty here before paying attention to the lyrics was, is this the English version or the German version?
Right.
That was the only significance of that song until you started to pay attention to the lyrics.
Yeah.
Well, and I remember seeing the video on MTV, and it was dark and it was gloomy, and I think it showed the wall there a little bit, but you weren't like really, the wall itself was not part of our culture growing up. When it fell, it was, because it became part of everything. I mean, the Scorpions had Winds of Change.
Yeah, Winds of Change.
And that became this global hit, and, that signified the fall. But, we just wanted to win the Cold War. We didn't really care about a wall.
See, one thing I've been self-congratulatory, pat on the back to myself for my whole life is I've always valued freedom. And I think that being very conscious of how blessed a life I've had, and even like, didn't grow up with everything, but always had that freedom. Mm-hmm. And to know that other people were finally given it was huge. And I don't think I've changed to this day, even looking at like the Chinese oppression or what's going on in Tibet, or even in countries like Indonesia and things like that, where there's still governments that are very oppressive to their people. And I think that's why here, politically, anytime I see politics move towards oppression, brings back the Berlin Wall type moments. Because not being able to travel here and there is akin to not being able to say this and that freely. You don't have that freedom of expression, freedom of movement, that freedom that God gives us. And so every time I see that, I always recoil from that.
So what should we be looking for here to be careful of so we don't
repeat history, right?
So what are the significant points that we need to be careful about?
Well, you think that the reason we ended up with the Berlin Wall is because when the Bolsheviks came to power in in Russia, when they overthrew the Tsar, they went to a stage of basically, instead of having this kumbaya moment, they did what all authoritarian governments do. They slaughtered a bunch of people, knew they had to keep slaughtering more to have control. Mm-hmm. Finally, the Second World War came along, a war they were either going to get overrun by the Germans or join the Allies. They joined the Allies fight, but then they didn't trust Truman, they didn't trust Churchill. And before you knew it, they ended up getting to Berlin just before the British and the Americans arrived there. Everyone's like zooming in on taking the prize. By the time we all got there, they were like, screw this, you guys are going to come for us next time. There was talk of nuking the Russians.
Well, Patton wanted to keep on rolling.
Yeah, and they wanted to nuke Russia after that. So they put up the Berlin Wall. They're like, the best thing we have is just seal off Eastern Europe, give us a buffer zone. So you got to know the history of that, and then you can look again at what's even the stupidity that's happening now with the Ukraine-Russia conflict over there right now. It's all about the same thing. Russia wanted a buffer zone. They didn't get a buffer zone, so they're like, hey, we're not going to just wait to be overrun. And so I think you can look at it in macro and micro situations with all geopolitical stuff and with local, that you've got to have people who are willing to give you the ability to live free. because I ain't going to live on my knees. I'd rather die on my feet. I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. And a lot of people did. And if people don't understand that history, it'll just happen again. And if they're not teaching it in schools, and no doubt my kids know what the Berlin Wall is.
Oh, I'm sure they don't. I don't think this is taught anymore. I think it was like maybe a bullet point on a, in one page of a textbook.
So to that point, Ian, you and I were talking earlier today. While I was doing some research on this, there was nowhere that I came across that referenced Ronald Reagan saying, Gorbachev, take down that wall.
Which is crazy.
Really?
Now, I didn't spend hours and hours researching, but
I actually
when you
found the
look
video.
at all of the information that's, the web search engines want to feed you what they think you want to know, no references.
That's interesting. So I specifically knew the phrase, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down
But it's
this
crazy.
wall.
There's a movie out about Reagan right now.
Right.
At the same time. And as well, this was the first wall that was put up to keep people in. Big wall. Hadrian's Wall in Scotland was to to protect the British from the Celts, or the Celts from the British. And the Great Wall of China, again, was to protect people from coming in.
Right.
Not to keep people from getting out. And that's what's so demonic about this twist that we have with that is, and again, people have equated Trump's wanting a wall on the southern border to the Berlin Wall. No, one's to keep people out, not to keep people in.
Right, right.
And that's the difference. Well, the Generation X, Berlin Wall, it's a great subject. Hopefully it sparks conversations with you out there listening with your friends. Where were you when it came down is the question I'd ask. And so, till next time, I'm Ian.
I'm Greg.
This is Loren.
And we'll see you again on Bonded Voices, Season 2, Generation X Edition.